All right, it's time to talk about dopamine.
Have you heard of dopamine dressing? Because that's the vibe I'm getting from you today with your bright sweatshirt.
No, I haven't heard of that.
Yeah,
That's cool that I knew
it's about
someone.
dressing for your mood. So it's often about wearing bright colors and just fun things to give you a dopamine boost. Well, that's the idea, but I don't know if that really is dopamine, that one, but
I kind of get it. In the book, they talked about the percentage of dopamine that gets released according to certain things, right? So chocolate being like, I forget, 20% dopamine release or something like that. Like sex is 100%. Opioids are like 1,000%. I would say this sweater is probably maybe 7%.
I also want to clarify that those percentages are in rats or mice. It's not humans, that one.
Well,
But Stephanie, what book are you talking about?
yeah. I'm talking about Dopamine Nation by Anna Lembke. I think I'm saying her name correctly. That's how I would pronounce Lembke, Lembke, MD. MD as in she's a doctor.
Yes.
It's not Lemke.
Yes. So I know that you read this book, especially for this podcast episode. I listened to the book maybe 6 months ago on Audible, and then I've reread it before today. So I've not heard any of your initial feedback, your responses. What was your initial reaction to the book?
As I was reading it, I was like, yeah, right. That sounds right. The more it sat, though, the more I was like, yeah. And now I feel really excited about it. I actually think there's a lot to take from it. And I'm cautious sometimes about talking about it through the lens of dopamine because I think that I remember I wanted neurotransmitters to be the reason that I had an eating disorder. Like
Yes.
I saw, and in fact, I pursued specialists and endocrinologists and all these kind of specialty tests to prove that, in fact, that was the reason that I was a food addict. And I don't know why I wanted that to be true. I guess it would. I like when I know about things and when I can name them and understand them. And also, I guess I felt like maybe there could be some kind of intervention, then I would know what to do. So while I think there's viability in, I think there is something you can really take from this, particularly the part I want to talk about. I'm trying to slow down, not to get to it too quickly. But also to recognize that it's a part of something. It's not the answer, right? Like I think there's other things to be addressing. And this is something that can help conceptualize some things, but it's not the whole story.
You're probably not surprised to hear I agree with what you say. Before coming into this recording today, I thought, it's a sticky topic to talk about in terms of how it can be received and what is actually useful for somebody listening to us talking about this. If you are somebody who is actively trying to eat less or control your food in a way that is mentally or physically restrictive, to be focusing on dopamine at the same time, I think you're just going to find yourself bouncing between the two. I mean, that's kind of where I was at. I wouldn't have thought about it in terms of dopamine. That wasn't the language back then, but I was in and out of abstinence and looking at it as an addiction, and my reward pathways are all out of whack. And then I would go into, oh no, it's about trying to control my food, and it's back and forth. I think there's an order to approaching recovery. And I think thinking about this pleasure pain balance and the reward system can be part of that journey. But if you try and jump ahead to this part, I think some people are going to find themselves, I guess, being pushed like one step forward and 3 steps back.
Yes. And what I actually thought was interesting, because I also read some interviews that Anna Lembke, has been on NPR, and it's talked about with food gets lumped in to these other factors like alcohol, drugs, social media, these other ways that we talk about addiction. And every time I see it, I'm like, you have to separate it. I don't know about maybe you have to separate other things too, but when we're talking about food, and you and I have talked about this before, and you're ignoring the psychological in that, yes, there's physiology, and that's what this book speaks to. But there is also psychology, and it is just as important. And if you ignore that, you are generalizing something that can't be generalized. Like you can't talk about food from a physiological perspective if you're not also factoring in the psychological ramifications of abstinence. For example, she, in this book, Anna talks about her main strategy that she uses is, what does she call it? I would call it abstinence. She calls it fasting, dopamine fasting, right? So this idea of not food fasting, but of restricting access to the addictive substance as a way of restoring the pain and pleasure balance, which we'll talk about in a minute. That's the point of the fast, right? It's not morality. It's more to reestablish homeostasis in your dopamine levels. However, yes, that makes sense on paper. But when you do that as somebody who has, if you have an eating disorder, if you have a disordered relationship with food, that fasting is going to create a whole host of other responses that aren't to do with dopamine, that are to do with autonomy and senses scarcity, and even, yes, the physiological impact of perceived scarcity when it comes to food, which is the survival response. And that's going to factor in, and you cannot ignore that. So I know that if I had read this book 10 years ago, I would have attempted to restrict my sugar, for example, or carbohydrates, or whatever I deemed too dangerous for me to eat or too addictive. And it would have worked for a little while, and then I would have binged on it and not understood why that was happening, because the reason that I would have binged on it would not have had to do with the dopamine pain pleasure balance. It would have had to do with the fact that I couldn't have the thing. You know what I mean? And that's, we have to talk about that in this conversation.
Agreed. And maybe we could start by just saying how Lembke, I'm going to have to practice
Lembke?
Lembke. I want to put the B in. I want to pronounce the B. Lembke. How she talks about dopamine. Because it's one of those words that can get thrown around. And actually, if you ask some people to say, well, define what dopamine is, well, you're probably going to get a variety of answers. So she says in the book, dopamine was first identified as a neurotransmitter in the human brain in 1957. Dopamine is not the only neurotransmitter involved in reward processing, but most neuroscientists agree it is among the most important. Dopamine may play a bigger role in the motivation to get a reward than the pleasure of the reward itself, wanting more than liking. Genetically engineered mice, unable to make dopamine, will not seek out food and will starve to death even when food is placed just inches from their mouth. Yet, if the food is put directly into their mouth, they will chew and eat the food and seem to enjoy it. How do mice look when they seem to enjoy their food?
That's such a good question.
I know, that always makes me giggle.
They have a little smirk.
Yes.
Like a cartoon mouse.
Yes.
This speaking to, right, the pursuit, like dopamine in the pursuit of. We had a question in our community yesterday, our podcast community, which PS, if you want to join, link is in show notes. Somebody had posted about this phenomenon of really almost feeling addicted to going to the grocery store to obtain binge foods. And she spoke about, like she said, I'm filling up my, she said trolley, I would say cart, she, like the act of getting and obtaining as actually the part of how, I don't know if she used the word addiction, but that's the way I read it. Like that was part of this like high that she was getting. And it wasn't, she never even spoke about bringing it home and eating it. It was more about this process of obtaining. And that's what this speaks to. That's where I would think this is a dopamine thing, where it's about the chase. And sometimes people will talk about that in terms of like the addiction to planning the binge and feeling like that high. I have a client who recently spoke of feeling relatively depressed. This factors in beautifully. She has stopped binging over the past month. She hasn't had a binge in over a month. And she said, I'm feeling a little low because I'm missing. It used to be this whole thing. It was like the idea, the conceptualization of the binge. And then, all right, when am I going to have time to go get this stuff? And then the going up, getting it, and the car ride there and the packages and that whole thing was part of the experience for her. And so there's not only is the binge hit missing, but also all the things surrounding it. And I remember I was reading the book at the time and thinking, oh, yeah, that's part of the dopamine experience. Like that's what that is that chasing. And that is part of binging too.
Yeah, and this concept makes a lot of sense to me. From my own experience, I would feel that it's a really hard feeling to even have the word for, but that anticipation, that going to the shops, the getting the food. And I remember for me, sometimes the moment it left me was just as I was buying the food. Once I actually had the food, before I'd even got home. That, don't get me wrong, there were other times where I couldn't wait to get home and eat the food. But I remember lots of occasions where after I bought the food, my desire for it diminished significantly. And that's what I think about when I'm listening to dopamine being talked about as being such a part of the motivation and the wanting and the chasing, and not necessarily as much, but I think it's still there in the actual reward element.
I don't want to go too far in the weeds because there's so much in this book that I want to get to, but it brings up the question, especially when we're talking about chasing and pursuing. Do you think that there's a relationship between this part of dopamine and when I did a post on this recently, completing a task, right? Have you ever heard from people or your own experience of like, I know when I'm writing an article or I've got something to do and it requires focus, there is something about snacking while you're doing that and like going back to the kitchen, and like the pursuit of obtaining is part of also the pursuit of completion of a task that's to do with something else, maybe work or school. Like, is there an association between why we might feel inclined to also pursue, like there's something turned on as a pursuit element that is also happening when you are chasing a result at, or completion of a task or something? Do you think it's related? Do you think it's not? Maybe we could just move on.
I think it absolutely could be for some people. I guess when I'm thinking about me, I think I would be more likely to snack during a task that I feel resentful of. When I'm absorbed in a task, food's not on my mind.
This is true.
So it's a little bit different. It's normally a task that I don't particularly want to do. I feel like I deserve something nice to make this a little bit easier.
I think that's a different element, like the reward of it or like the boredom of it. I just wondered, because for me, agreed that once I'm in it, I'm in it. But sometimes when I'm thinking about wanting to get to the completion of it before I'm in the flow, almost like there's something in my brain that happens where it's like, go get things, go get things, and then once I'm invested, and then I forget about it. But there's something almost like in that precursor. Anyway, maybe that's a different topic. But can I share what my biggest takeaway and the most helpful part, I think, when it comes to this conversation? All right. Well, maybe we should explain first the sort of seesaw of the pain pleasure balance, right? And she does this really well in the book. There's an illustration of it, and I find illustrations really helpful. But if you could picture like a seesaw, right? And on one side of the seesaw is pain, and on the other side of the seesaw is pleasure. So the theory goes that our body has pain and pleasure are very closely linked in our brains, right? They're not different things. They're part of the same seesaw, and the brain wants to always have homeostasis between the two. So whenever you experience pleasure, you will also always experience pain when that pleasure ends. So if you've got the seesaw and you put something, let's say food, because obviously on the pleasure side, right? And it tips the seesaw. So now we have an imbalance towards pleasure. And then the meal ends, the snack ends, whatever, right? And so we have to get back to homeostasis. So there's got to be a little pain to restore the tilt, right? And that pain I perceive as the incredible discomfort that can come with a meal ending, something being over. Sometimes, and they talk about it in the book as a craving, like a craving for more of that pleasure hit, right? Because once you start to experience the pain that would counterbalance it, everything back to neutral, we don't want pain. And that was the other part. There's a sentence in the book that says we are biologically wired towards pain and away from pleasure. We will resist pain and we will move towards pleasure. And this is how we've survived. So this is not a character issue. Again, I say that all the time, but I think that we think that we're gluttonous people for wanting pleasure and avoiding pain. No, this is how we are. So there is this instinct to not like when the discomfort starts to happen to counterbalance. But what I think, and in my own experience of how I've experienced that, is that part where the pleasure ends and the discomfort comes in to restore the balance always to me felt like, and I have this issue in general where I feel like whenever I experience pain and discomfort, I have this feeling inside like it will never end. I know cognitively that feelings pass and all that. But I've spoken about this when I get sick too. I feel like it's just for the rest of my life, I'm going to feel this way. And it feels so urgent and like scary to me that I just want to get out of it. And I think this has a lot to do with the intolerance of discomfort. And I don't know why. And it doesn't matter. Maybe the point is that I understand. When I read that, I was like, oh, that really helps me conceptualize any time that I feel discomfort and I feel like it never is going to end. And if I could just understand that that's just a natural process of my brain getting back to homeostasis. And once it does, it will feel okay again. Everything will restore back to normal. Then I can hang on. Like, then I feel like I'm like, okay, if that's what's happening in my brain, fine. I will just grin and bear it because I understand what it's doing now. Versus I think before it would have felt like the absence of food, or now it's other things, would have felt like a dangerous thing. And that my brain would have interpreted it as, pain, get away, go towards the thing that's pleasure, but the more we're offering ourselves the pleasure, the more we're actually habituating. And that's another part of the conversation, that we habituate towards the pleasure. And then we are less and less able to tolerate pain. And when I say pain, I think I mean more discomfort. But I think this is a helpful thing to take from this book when it comes to sitting with an emotion or understanding what the body is really doing when we are feeling the distress of having a meal end or having food not be there, and that why we're feeling that incredible amount of discomfort with that.
I'm having so many thoughts at the moment. I'm trying to grab a hold of one. This is where it gets really complicated. And she acknowledges this in the book as well. Firstly, does everyone's seesaw work? That there could be some people's brains, if we look, if we just mentioned ADHD as one, some kind of clinical depression, all kinds of imbalances in the brain, that means that this mechanism is not going to work well. What she's speaking to is that we live in a world with a lot of stimulus, a lot of ways of seeking very instant pleasure. So I think she's speaking to, and this is why, one of the caveats here, she's speaking to the people perhaps whose brains are able to regulate this, but our environment has made it quite difficult to do so. And also, when we're talking about pleasure and pain, it made me think of, when people are saying, oh, things are going really well, or I'm feeling really good about this thing, and I don't trust it. I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop, which almost sounds like, I'm too happy up here on this high end of the seesaw that at some point the pain lever is going to kick in. And she talks about it as well in terms of, I don't know if she uses exactly these words, but she talks about it in a few different ways. But I understood it as being like hedonistic pleasure, which you think of in things like substances that you might use, or even this instant gratification culture that we live in, or pornography and sex addiction that she talks about quite a bit in there as well. Gambling, things that we have available in our lives, means that we can give that pleasure lever a really good press, which does something chemically in our brain, and our brain's like, no, we need to balance this out. It's like if you go out and get high on cocaine or something, you're going to have a come down the next day. This is the kind of thing that we're talking about. However, if you go somewhere and you see a beautiful sunset, and maybe you're moved to tears, and like looking at this sunset just brings up this incredible feeling of feeling good, that's not the same mechanism, I would say. And the book does acknowledge that it's not only dopamine that has this effect, but it's drawing this distinction here. And this is where it gets tricky with food as well. When we talk about certain foods being more rewarding than other foods, certain foods might activate this pleasure on the seesaw balance more than other foods. Discuss. It sounded like I was ramping up to a conclusion, but I wasn't.
Yeah. What was the last sentence you just said? It sounds like what?
Well, that certain foods are going to be like, are going to affect this system more. And what does that mean if we find that we are chasing, and this is something we are struggling to control? Because obviously she recommends abstinence for a period of time and then experimenting to see if you can reintroduce whatever the thing was that was causing this system to be imbalanced. Now, we know that can be problematic for a lot of people with disordered eating, history of restriction, food rules, all of that. And that's, I think, where it gets pretty sticky when we're talking
sticky.
about
It's going to be
food.
sticky.
It's
However,
going to
we
get really
talk about
sticky,
it.
Steph. Yeah.
Because
Maybe we should just end the episode here.
Okay. Thank you for
not getting
listening.
into it.
Go read the book. Take of it what you will. Okay. Here's what's in my mind right now is the M&M jar. So at Costco, do you have Costco there?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So they have in the candy aisle this huge clear plastic container of M&Ms, or like peanut M&Ms. They have two. So they're beautiful, right? I've spoken about this. I have this thing. I'm just so drawn to this from both a taste perspective and a sensory, like colors. And I just want to get my hands in. I was swimming it. I want to like scoop it. I don't know. And when I see that, there is something in that, perhaps to your point about colors, like there is something that lights up. There is something I get very excited about the pursuit of it, really. And I don't mind eating it either. Like, also, that's worth noting. And this availability conversation, right? So we have so many things in our environment. Social media is a great example of this too, where it's like, it's just in our hands. Like it's so easy to access, right? And more so than our brains are designed to withstand. So I dislike the conversation about, that wellness culture will use about, they demonize foods because everything's so hyper palatable and it's so available. And there's a lot of morality around resisting that. And I don't like that conversation. I think it's really unhelpful in so many ways. However, I also think that there's truth to the fact that you can go get this huge thing of M&Ms. And if you left it in your kitchen, just because you're a human who likes pleasurable things and is drawn towards colors and textures, and that is doing something to your brain, that you would be inclined, it would nudge you. And we talked about this. I forget the episode that we talked about it. I think food addiction or food abstinence episode about the nudge theory. And that is not your fault. It's not because you're a food addict. It's because you are going to be inclined towards things like that. Now, for me, it's M&Ms. It might not be for you, right? It's going to be different for everybody. And they do speak about the individualization of these pathways, and we all have unique setups of them. I know that bucket of M&Ms has everything to do with something inside of me that feels a lot like dopamine, that I would move towards it. Now, I also think 10 years ago, if that had been in my kitchen, I would have devoured it in a day. Now, I would not do that because, again, this is not just about dopamine. There's other things, and habituation is a factor, right? Like it is allowed to me, and if it's around me, I can stop. But I will be more inclined to go get it more often than if it wasn't around. And that's because of this pain and pleasure balance. So I used to think, in my referencing our anti-diet identity episode, in the height of my anti-diet pendulum swing, that like all you had to do was habituate food and you would not want it anymore. And I had proof of that because it had happened to me. I mean, there are foods that exist in my home all the time that I'm not going towards the way I used to because of these other factors, right? But there's still the truth of the matter is that if the M&M jar is in my house, I'm going to be eating more M&Ms. And that's just because they'll nudge me. And that's because of this phenomenon that goes on with dopamine, I believe. It's at least part of the story. And that doesn't make me a bad anti-dieter. It doesn't make me addicted. It doesn't mean I haven't fully worked through my food issues. It's simply because it's there, the same way I scroll Facebook Reels and TikToks, because it's in my hand and because it's really easy and because we are geared to move towards those things and away from not those things. You know what I mean? So I think it's sticky to talk about because I might have taken that and said, well, then I don't need to worry about habituating foods. I don't need to worry about my relationship with the food. I just need to make sure it's not around me, because this gives me an excuse to say that's why I need food to be away, because I'm going to be addicted to it. And that's only part of the story. There is absolutely a place for repairing your relationship with food, your judgments around food, habituating foods, and you will still have to consider the dopamine, and that's okay too. Like having certain foods in front of you, you will lean towards them. And that is true, but it doesn't necessarily make you an addict, except in certain situations, which I will also talk about, but I want to give you airtime because I just get so buffed about it.
It's also important to add that you do eat M&Ms, just in case anybody here is thinking that you put in a hard rule about M&Ms because of this impact.
Right.
You've just found ways of going, okay, this is how I feel okay. And if I have more than this around me, I know I'm going to have to deal with a lot of these nudges.
Yes.
And maybe I don't want to have to do that. So when would you have M&Ms?
Like when I'm at CVS, like a pharmacy or something, and I'm the ones by the counter, sometimes they'll nudge me. And sometimes I'll be like, you know what? I'd really like some, or I'll buy some and have them later. Halloween, I have them. If my kids bring them home, I have them. But they come more in like the packages, like a standard package of M&Ms, and that's good for me. Like that's enough for me. Whereas I might overeat them if they come in the Costco container because, well, sometimes it's not like every time standardly that's what would happen, but there's going to be moments where you're plain and this is Sally sells seashells. Your pain pleasure balance is going to be different at different times, as well as hormone impact. There's just different times where I feel more susceptible to numbing out or to, I don't know, feel more impulsive than other times. So I guess I just have them when I choose to have them, which comes up every now and then, or when they're in front of me. That also will happen. Like at Halloween, if they're there, I'll eat them. But I don't generally have them around me constantly because it's part of this nudging that I don't need to be dealing with, and no one's in my house is asking for it. So, okay.
So what you're describing, do you think it could come under what Anna? Oh, why did I call her Anne? Or Anna in the book?
I did too.
Yeah.
I think
what is that?
Up. I don't know.
That genuinely feels like one of those Mandela effect moments where I'm like, I'm sure it's been Anne all this time. That's weird. Yeah. Oh, how funny.
Her name's
anyway.
Anna.
Would you say that then goes into what she says about self-binding? Because she talks about self-binding as like putting in barriers between you and the dopamine-inducing object of your desire.
Right. And to just qualify that's so she's basically talking about like making it harder to access the thing. But there's first of all, the word binding is like, I don't react well to it. And I don't know if she means it that way or if that matters to me to answer this question. Binding to me sounds like I'm not allowed, and that is not going to work for me. That's not the case with M&Ms. If you're talking about that word or that phenomenon in terms of like making it harder to get, that's kind of what I do, I suppose. Not on purpose. I don't think about it like that, but when I pass them in Costco, I'm not like, ooh, let me go get them. Because I don't know, I just don't think that anyway. But I suppose there is some kind of implicit happening in my mind of like, I'm not buying. I notice them and I don't buy them. And I suppose it's too many factors to name, but like, yeah, I think that's part of the way this all works, and that certain foods are going to be, I'm going to go for them more often. They're going to nudge me more often. And so I'm not putting myself in that position. But still, it's not a rule, and it's not a never situation.
Yeah, because thinking about it, with share-sized bags of chocolate candy, I wouldn't very often buy them because I know there's a negotiation about how much you eat and when. So I'm more likely to buy the portion that I want. But sometimes I do buy them. And I'm not quite sure when that would be. But I think on the whole, and this is why it doesn't feel like a rule. And I think when you start turning it into a rule, it gets a bit sticky and tricky with disordered eating. Quite often I'm thinking I don't want to have to negotiate.
Right. It takes too much energy.
This food. And even that, it's not quite sitting right. I mean, maybe it does just come back to nudge theory. Maybe we're, I'm repeating myself a bit here. So let's press on because we've still got a few things to get through. I found it very interesting when she was talking about pushing on the pain side. So when she's talking about this balance, what I took away from that when she started talking about pain was about deliberately choosing pain. And I might reword that to discomfort or effort, because I don't think it's necessarily pain, because she's describing how the application of pain triggers the body's own endogenous self-made opioids. So by going the other way with the seesaw, you press on the pain first, then you get the reward that brings you back into balance. What did you make of that?
Like, she uses the examples, I think, of the one that in my mind is, again, this has so many intersections with wellness culture. Cold showers.
Yes.
It's like a PS. I just want to say that every book you read, the author has had an intersection themselves with diet culture. So please read with care, because sometimes the examples given can also be factoring in other moral things that aren't necessarily to do with their point. But there is this discussion of like taking cold showers. What's the other one? There's 3 she talks about.
Yeah, but you have this reaction, which I find interesting sometimes, against this cold water thing, because I know it can be linked to other things. And the research that she cites talks about how exposure to cold water increases dopamine levels in the blood by 250%. I went through stages of doing cold, just the last 30 seconds of my shower on an icy blast, and I felt really invigorated. I felt really good. And I hate the cold. I'm somebody that will do everything to avoid the cold.
Yeah.
So when I reread this book for this episode, I was thinking, oh, I want to do that cold thing again.
Yeah. Yes. Well, ironically, I had a client call yesterday with somebody who is one of the, I would say, like her experience with orthorexia, wellness culture, and eating disorder is so very, very significant, very, very significant. And she's done a ton of work to get away from that and is still lured in by these kind of headlines. And so all I'm thinking is like, oh, if I even say this and she listens, there's going to be some kind of like, I should get back to that. And the reason I react this way is because why you do something matters very, very, very much. And so I think that a lot of people who do the cold water plunges and things like that are doing it for reasons that are not yet deconstructed. And I'm very cautious about promoting that. So I will admit that I agree. I believe your benefit and it's valid, but also there's many people who hear that stuff and know that stuff only under the lens of somehow controlling. It has to do with control and with morality.
Understood. And the why that you mentioned is so important. So when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about, let's say I went out hiking for the afternoon and I do a 4-hour hike and I push my body and my body's tired and achy. That meal I have after that hike is going to taste incredible. Like it's going to be so, I'm feeling excited just thinking about it. I'm not even planning on going hiking. That's the brain anticipating, folks.
Like I'm going to plan it.
Compared to somebody who goes, right, I am going to eat hardly anything today so that I can allow myself to eat something later. Maybe they even go and do the hiking. They do the same thing as I do, but from a different motivation of I need to earn my calories for that food later. Those 2 reasons really matter. Like the mechanism might be a similar mechanism, but for me, it's almost like if you pursue this pain and discomfort from a place of shame, fueled by shame. Ooh, I don't know why I got all like that. Yeah. I even made a fist with my hand. Like I felt like an evangelical preacher for a moment then. Yeah, but if you take this action and the energy behind it is shame driven, I don't know what happens then, Steph.
Well, what happens is that you're reinforcing something else, right? So this happens with the idea of fasting too. People will say, and I experienced, I think you've talked about it as well, that fasting can bring on this high. This is euphoria as well, especially when, and I remember like I would fast all day, eat at night, and that meal was so pleasurable and felt so good. Yes, because of this dopamine pain pleasure balance, but also because I felt like I was better. Like I felt like I'd earned it. So it's also reinforcing things that are perpetuating your eating disorder, right? So it's not just then the dopamine thing you're dealing with. You're also dealing with, you're reinforcing morality, you're reinforcing punishment and earning and what makes you good and what makes you bad. And that stuff is going to perpetuate your eating disorder in other ways beyond the dopamine stuff. You know what I mean? So that matters.
Yes. And that episode that we did about using food as a reward could also play into this here as well. If you have a day where you are putting out, doing things for other people, and then at the end of the day, your brain is going like, we need to rebalance this. We need some pleasure. That can be another way of trying to get to this place of equilibrium. That could be what's going on at the neurological level. It may feel like it's not working for you long time, because actually a lot of the pain and discomfort you might be going through doesn't really feel like a choice. For most people, it feels like, oh, this is just what they have to do. They're not necessarily choosing it freely each day because they just want to be of service to those around them. They feel like there's no choice. So there's a stress element of that too.
I wonder too if when you do this pain for pleasure thing, I think this for me, I'm thinking about restrictors a lot. Like this might be how anorexia is more in line with that. Like you end up feeling like you go through the pain to deserve the pleasure. And what you were talking about earlier about seeing a sunset and how like that, I think it precludes that. I think that then you have to have pain to experience pleasure, and that becomes that becomes something solidified. And then you don't have access to pleasure for pleasure's sake, or like the beauty of a sunset, you know what I mean? Like, or those kind of pleasures. I think you lose that. You lose gratitude. You lose glimmer moments. You lose access to that because pleasure is then only associated with pain.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's different. I think we're talking about something in the body that's very powerful and very big, but that there's also other things. There's other mechanisms at play that's going to intersect with this. It does not exist in a vacuum.
No. Yeah, your belief system's going to play a massive role in this.
I think it's also worth talking about like the habituation of it. The more you hit the pleasure button as an effort to escape the discomfort of the pain homeostasis balance, and you were talking about where this can get dysregulated and where it doesn't function well. I think ADHD is I'm going to leave that as a separate mechanism, but I'm going to talk about it through the lens of depression because that's where I really felt this. I was thinking back to college, as you know, and other times in my life, but that time was particularly painful. And where this was the time that I felt most like an addict in terms of like there was no physical restriction going on at all. It was only binging every day. And I would wake up and binge. Like I would go right into it. And I couldn't tolerate the discomfort of not having it. It very much felt like drugs. You know what I mean? Where like the more you have, the more you need to feel the pleasure. And then the more you're imbalanced, so it ends up becoming this huge like lack of equilibrium. Whereas now I feel like my plain, this happens in a much more moderated way. Still there's discomfort involved, but not to the degree that it was then. Then it was like I was food, piling up on the side of the seesaw that, felt pleasure, needing more and more and more and more and more of it to feel the same amount of pleasure. Whereas now I can get the pleasure hit from one thing, whereas I needed 70 things last time in college. And therefore the pain I would need to balance it, like the pain required to come back to homeostasis, was so much bigger, because that's the difference between now, if a meal ends, I feel a little bit of discomfort of like, oh, but then it was like the pleasure was so, I had 50 things of ice cream in order to feel the same pleasure that I get from a dinner now. And in order to balance it, now it takes a little 10 minutes of discomfort or 10 seconds. And then it took way too much out of me. It was like death. It was like the not having the ice cream in the morning when I woke up was like the worst feeling in the world. And I didn't have the energy to tolerate it because I was I had so many other things. I had depression. So it's like nothing. I wasn't socializing. I had no self-esteem. I had no purpose. There was so much pain that, you know what I mean? And I think to conceptualize like what's going on there is, it's not so simple when you've piled, when your pleasure, you keep going for the hits. And I think this is what happens with bingers, less so than binge restrictors. The binge is all that food all the time becomes a way that we completely imbalance this scale. And it's almost intolerable to wait for that balance to come back out. I mean, she suggests restriction, which it doesn't mean food restriction. I think in that sense, what you would do is like, it would be binging restriction, where you stop binging so much, which is essentially, I think, how I got to the place I'm at today, because slowly over time, something shifted. But you can't just do that. Like, you can't just restrict your binges. I mean, that's what everybody tries to do all the time. So I don't think it's helpful for conceptualizing. It's not helpful for behavior, because you can't preclude yourself from binging just because you think it would be a good idea.
I do think with the abstinence part that when I don't know why I always have to go. I've spoken about this loads on the podcast before. I just always feel like I have to say that beforehand. When I did my 2 months where I separated eating foods that I thought of as binge foods and watching television, I wouldn't eat basically sweet foods, quote unquote processed foods in front of the television. And I did that for 2 months. That did feel like a type of abstinence. There was something very rewarding about the combination of those two. And having that 2 month break and riding out the discomfort of that enabled me to find a bit more balance going forward.
Yeah.
So that makes sense to think of that as this balance that we're talking about here. And again, I'm not recommending this to anybody else. This was something that I decided to do for myself. It wasn't advice that was given to me. So it didn't come from a place that felt rule-based or restriction-based. But I guess that's one way that I might think of abstinence potentially
I
being
agree.
around somewhere for me.
I agree. I think it's like why you abstain, because I think part of getting away from that binging every single day thing had to do with doing it less and less, and then it becoming less and less rewarding. But the reason that I did it less and less, it could never have happened if I said to myself, which I tried to say, I'm not going to do this anymore. But what did happen is that I ended up having friends that kind of intervened on my behalf and started to really hold me up and like visit my dorm room and against my will socialize, you know what I mean? And over time that started to naturally crowd out the binges a little bit. And the more and more they got crowded out, which is a version of abstaining, but not as the direct, it was a byproduct. And that mattered because that my psychology could handle. And then there was not the rebel response because it felt very natural. And that's why that part matters. Like, I can understand that whole process and why it worked through this lens, but you can't make it work on purpose like that necessarily. You know what I mean? It's because you've got psychology involved. So it has to be almost this organic process of abstinence where it makes sense to your psychology. And then the rebel doesn't need to fight for itself.
One of the things I did like about the book, towards the end of the book, she talks about some bigger themes that can help with this plain or managing this plain pet. You're right, it's hard to say.
It is.
That can help with managing this plain. I'm going to get there. That can help with managing this pain pleasure balance. Were you surprised when these came up? Because the first one being radical honesty, which is about truth telling.
I loved that.
I did too. There were so many things that came up for me around that, because I remember during my teenage years and early 20s, I would say that I lied pretty easily.
Me too.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. And no, I don't even know if guilt would be the right word now, but I've become a lot more committed to this over the last 6-7 years. And I don't know if I told you about when I was in India with the air conditioning.
I think you did. I don't know if you told listeners.
Yeah, so when we arrived, we were asked if we wanted a room with air conditioning, and you had to pay however many rupees it was a day, about £7 a day. And so I said, yes, please. So we got the room with the air conditioning in. But the guy who checked us in, we never saw him again. And then maybe 2 weeks into it, one of the staff was going around asking who was using the air conditioning to find out who needed to be charged, because they had made a record of who had requested air conditioning and who had not. Now, my self-righteous sense of justice used it as a way of going, well, I'm sleeping with exposed asbestos by my head. Asbestos is flaking off the wall in my room. We've had problems with even getting water. There were so many ways that I was indignant that we had not been looked after properly. I was like, no, we're not using the air conditioning. And it came out so easily. I even said, no, we're not using the air conditioning. It just dries my throat out. And then I was like, afterwards, I was like, where did that come from? And it ate away at me.
Oh,
Not in. And this is the thing, because it wasn't about, I felt bad for them that I somehow wasn't paying them what they were owed. I still had a sense of justice in me about that. It was in me. It was for me. So it was not about being honest to them. And I found the receptionist and I said, I tried to fudge it out. And I said, oh, we've just decided to start using the air conditioning. So she was like, okay, well, we'll just charge you for the remaining 10 days or whatever. But then that wasn't enough. I could still feel it just wasn't sitting right in me. So when I went to pay, I just went to give her the full amount of cash, hoping she wouldn't say anything. And then she said, "Oh, no, you only know this." And I was like, I'll just give you the full amount. And she goes, no, but you only owe this. And I said, well, I wasn't entirely honest with you.
Oh,
and inside, when you're, I felt a little bit sick because you don't know what someone's reaction is going to be when you basically said, yeah, I just lied to you to try and get out of paying you.
yeah.
And she just burst into laughter.
Oh,
It was like the funniest thing that I tried to get away without paying for the air conditioning. But then there was this sense of like, I could settle and it felt okay. And we had one where I'd sent you a text message and I spoke to you about it later. And I said, Steph, that message I sent you wasn't really true. And I think I was trying to elicit a certain response from you. And that felt really hard to do, but also really important. And I guess I think for the benefit of the listeners, I just want to share a couple of things she said about the importance of this. Because if I was listening to this, I'd be thinking, well, I want to stop binging, or I just want to.
Right. What does this have to do with it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. What has this got to do with anything? So Anna says, first, radical honesty promotes awareness of our actions. Second, it fosters intimate human connection. Third, it leads to a truthful autobiography which holds us accountable not just to our present, but also to our future selves. Further, telling the truth is contagious and might even prevent the development of a future addiction. Sounds like grand claims, but we know that if you stimulate someone's prefrontal cortex, it causes them to be more honest and more truthful. So the question is being posited in the book. What if that can happen the other way around as well? Because the stronger our prefrontal cortex,
right,
the more executive control we have and the more we can manage this part. I'll just finish off by one last paragraph. Consistent with the lived experience of people in recovery, truth-telling may change the brain, allowing us to be more aware of our pleasure-pain balance and the mental processes driving compulsive overconsumption, and thereby change our behavior. That, I think, is for each person to test out for themselves, but it really intuitively feels true to me and for me.
With a caveat to me, because I know people who have super duper executive functioning brains, who are super successful and use, their executive functioning brain, discipline, willpower, logic, reason, all of it, connection, every day a lot, like in their work and things like that, and still struggle with this primal part of the brain, which is, so I think that the honesty has to be related to the addiction. So I don't think honesty in and of itself builds up the brain, the executive functioning part of the brain to somehow balance out the limbic system. I think that it has to be connected. I think that, and she does talk about like being honest about your addictive behaviors. And I think that matters. I think that otherwise they can stay compartmentalized.
I'm friends with a girl who used to be a heroin addict, and she's saying she can't even tell white lies now. It's so important for her to be truthful because it's a slippery slope back.
Yeah.
Because there's a certain level of self-deception that needs to happen with compulsion. Because in the moment of the compulsive behavior, you have to convince yourself of something in order to satisfy that. What I mean by, just hear me out, Steph. I can see your face, so you're not looking impressed, but let me finish. What I mean by is the amount of times I would say to myself, this is the last time, I'll do it tomorrow. Now, if I was in my right mind at that time, I would know that wasn't true. I had hundreds, if not thousands of examples of that not being true. Yet each time I could convince myself that that was true. Yeah. There is a level of self-deception needed in some disordered eating behaviors. Yes, Steph's not liking this at all. Okay, the some, I want to back a bit on the some eating disorder behaviors whereby a shift in attitude towards more radical honesty. And I don't mean it as in you just go around telling everyone what you think all the time. Again, I'm just being honest, but that top looks gross on you.
No, to yourself. Yes. Honesty with yourself too.
And with others, primarily. In relationship with others, about the important things. For me, I can't just change something in one place and not somewhere else. For me, it has to happen everywhere in order for it to be a consistent change. So I couldn't decide to just be more honest about eating, food, and body image. I'd have to be more honest about everything because I can't compartmentalize like that. Without
some
cost.
People can. Some people can. I can.
Without
a cost, for sure. I just mean I can, and I would try. But I agree with you. What you said, I do actually agree with. I think that's so helpful for some people. But I just have to say the caveat of self-deception is not the only, it's because under that lens, it would be true that if in a moment of a binge that I had, that if I just was honest with myself and recognized that it wasn't true that this would be the last time, that somehow would have made a difference. And it would not have, because a lot of my binging was driven by factors that were beyond my ability to control. They weren't about awareness or willpower. I knew, but I don't think I even I don't think I ever was, I did for some time be like on Monday, but after a while I was like, I know that this is BS. Like this is just happening to me. I knew that I couldn't stop it. So I don't think we have as much control. I don't think everybody has as much control as awareness provides. I think sometimes there's a physiological reason that the binge is happening. Awareness is always great. I think it's never not helpful. Well, maybe not never, but it's not the only driver for many people with eating disorders. Some people.
I guess there's something in the moment, though, of knowing the truth, because in the moment, I would genuinely believe this would be the last time.
Yeah, no,
and that wasn't true. And now I understand what you're saying. Like, you could acknowledge what was true and still binge. And of course you can. I'm not saying it also happens the other way around. I'll see it with people all the time. They'll go, I'm not restricting. I'm this, that. I've listened to all the stuff, and I'll say, okay, what are you eating before 5 p.m.? And quite often they're not eating anything till 2 p.m. But they have managed to convince themselves, despite over and over again hearing people say, really, you need to be trying eating stuff earlier in the day. See what happens. Test it out for yourself. I'm not telling people how they should eat, but if you haven't tried this and then you're saying it cannot be restriction, that is self-deception.
Yeah. Okay.
Not deliberate.
You knew just how to get to my heart.
Yeah. Love you, Stef.
I'm not going to argue with that one.
So just before we finish up, I just want to touch on what she says about shame. Because when she first started talking about shame, I was like, yes, this is what it's all about. I love talking about shame. But she distinguishes two types of shame as destructive shame and pro-social shame. And she's saying that the pro-social shame is the good kind of shame. And I feel like I want another word for it than even shame, because shame to me doesn't feel
like there is no good kind of shame.
Yeah, she talks about a guy who, when his wife finds out about his addiction, he sees the disappointment and whatever in her
accountability.
Eyes. Yeah, accountability, but also that ability to self-critique, to go, actually, that's not okay. What I'm doing, what I'm not doing. And I can take a moment to feel that, to feel the discomfort of that not being okay without tumbling into, I'm the worst person in the world. She talks a lot about connection and community, helping to reduce shame. We have a community. Check it out in the show notes below. So the idea of self-critique, I think, is a little bit more helpful. So recently, I was self-reflecting over something and I felt like I'd let someone down, and I did what I could to repair it, but I was still conscious I'd let someone down. And I shared it with a friend, just how I was feeling. And I said, and I don't want any reassurance from you at the moment. I just need you to listen, which was really hard for her because she could see all the reframes and wanted to reassure me. And I just needed to feel bad for a little bit.
Yeah.
I hadn't gone into a shame hole, but I just needed to have that space. And I don't have a word for this feeling. I'm just saying feeling bad, which doesn't feel like it quite captures it. It also wasn't quite guilt, because there was part of me that knows I acted with the information I had at the time. And part of me that thought, if you'd stopped and reflected a bit sooner, maybe you could have done something different, but I don't know that for sure. And that, I think, is the bit for me that is the helpful part, is being able to go, yes, I messed up. I can feel the feelings of that without tumbling, like my whole sense of self and identity and worth being tied up in that.
I mean, I don't know how this, all of a sudden I feel like I need to confess my thing. Just like yesterday, this happened to me as well, where I didn't do something I should have done with my mother-in-law. And then it got to the point where I was like, oh gosh, like I really need to speak to her about the fact that I didn't. And I did. I was careful because there's some kind of instinct to like make excuses or to justify. And I didn't. And I was just like, I apologize for X, Y, and here's what I meant. Here's what I wanted to say originally, and said it and left it. And there was some kind of, there's a humility in this, but it's also and I don't know that I could have ever done it when I was binge. Like, you're right. I guess there is some kind of crossover that happens with like honesty that does transcend just that thing. Like, it's almost harder. I think it would have been so much harder to do that if I'd been binging. Why? I don't know. I guess like there's some shame that transcends, like everything. Whereas that's not present. I don't feel shame. I really don't feel, I must somewhere. I got to look for it, but I don't feel like I connect to that word anymore, that emotion anymore, but I'll take way more accountability now. And I think that's why, you know what I mean? Because I don't need to have shame if I can take that accountability and sit with that feeling and own it. Then, you know what I mean? I don't know why that connects, but it does. I don't know what it has to do with dopamine.
Well, it's being able to still feel some kinds of quote unquote negative emotions about ourselves and our actions without making it mean we are the worst, we're worthless, we don't have value. Because people often think that self-compassion is letting themselves off the hook and not even allowing themselves to have any of those harder feelings when they feel like they've messed up. And actually it is allowing yourself to feel disappointed with yourself sometimes, to feel like you might have failed at something, but without becoming that.
Well, that the connection is that you can feel this discomfort or pain without needing to escape it with a pleasure hit, right? Like, it's the tolerance of that other side of the seesaw. Whereas I think that in a binge or addicted, like there is some kind of, I need the pleasure. I got to escape the pain. She describes very much in the book about how so much of addictive behavior is driven by the intolerance of pain. And I guess what we're talking about is being able to tolerate that discomfort and like just be with that.
Yes. Which means we can nicely end on a quote from the book, which is actually from chapter 2, but we're going to conclude with it. Anna says, "The reason we're all so miserable may be because we're working so hard to avoid being miserable." So the takeaway is, go be unhappy, folks, and then you'll feel better.
Literally, like,
pretty much.
That is the message.
But choose it so that, there's an empowerment in it, at least. Okay. We could draw a load of conclusions, but I think we could
I could talk for another hour about that. Like, so I'm glad we did this. Let us know, folks, what other books you'd like us to talk about, because this was fun.
Yeah. Or if there's any themes that have come up, because there's a lot in this book. So there might have been bits that we just touched on that could be a whole episode in and of themselves. So let us know if you would like us to do that. Okay, everyone. Okay, Stephanie.
Okay.
Cheerio.
Alrighty then. Cheerio.
See you next time.